Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start our presentation off today with an artifact. This is the Hereford Mappa Mundi, or map of the world, a map of the Earth and the cosmos that hangs in Hereford Cathedral in England. But it does not resemble the maps with which we're familiar. That's because it's known as an OT map. An OT map, where the East is up top, Asia is above Europe, and the center is Jerusalem rather than Greenwich. And the reason I bring this map up is it gives us an opportunity to see how the medieval as a category can reorient our thinking, decenter our thinking, help us move away from established patterns and look at the world afresh by putting ourselves in contrast or counterpoint to a previous age. I then like to begin with a quote from God Passes By. In this seminal theological history of the Baha'i faith, Shoghi Effendi talks about the persecution of the Babis, of course, and speaks of a number of prominent personalities who have commented on the Babi persecution. One of them, Lord Curzon of Kettleston, who was one-time Viceroy of India. And Curzon writes, using a peculiar allusion, "Tales of magnificent heroism," writes Kettleston, "illumine the blood-stained pages of Babi history. The fires of Smithfield did not kindle a nobler courage than has met and defied the more refined torture mongers of Tehran." What are the fires of Smithfield? This reference caught my curiosity. The reference comes from Lord Curzon's book, Persia and the Persian Question. You see in this image from the Library of Congress. And what he's referring to are the burnings of heretics which took place in 16th century London under three Tudor monarchs, Mary through Henry VIII, primarily of Protestant martyrs, among them the famous Bishop Thomas Cranmer, as detailed in Virginia Browning's book, The Burning Time. So we see the Babis being compared to the persecuted Protestants of the 16th century. As documented in Fox's Book of Martyrs, an early polemical work in favor of the Protestant cause, which used framed Catholicism as a barbarous faith which persecuted innocent Protestants. So what we see here is the Middle Ages, the Reformation, and the early modern period in general being used as a reference into which the modern world can be compared or the modern world can be distinguished from. So we see that this allusion to the martyrs of Smithfield, chosen very specifically by The Guardian from Kettleston's writings, would have been very resonant with his Anglophone audiences, who are acquainted with the usages of the Middle Ages and the Reformation in rhetoric. I'd like to show you a few more citations, and this set me on a search for references to the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and Reformation in the Baha'i writings of the central figures, and found quite a few. For example, in Secret of Divine Civilization, Abdu'l-Baha describes the 10 centuries constituting the Middle Ages as, in every respect and to an extreme degree, barbaric and dark, citing the noted historians of Europe. One of them we know is a man by the name of Draper. I'd be interested for your insights onto what other historians Abdu'l-Baha may have been drawing upon. So we see the Middle Ages beginning to be framed in Baha'i discourse as barbaric, dark, other, distant from us. But this is not the only reference to the Middle Ages as a supposedly dark period in Abdu'l-Baha's writings. In his 24 May 1912 talk to the Unitarian Conference, he uses the phrase, "With the mask of obscurity which beclouded medieval centuries, meet the demand for clear-eyed vision and understanding which characterizes the world today." Yet again, Abdu'l-Baha in the promulgation uses medieval as an adjective of contradistinction and indeed condemnation. Among the teachings of Baha'u'llah is the principle of equality of man and woman. In ancient times, in medieval ages, woman was completely subordinated to man. So the medieval period is again framed as a time of distance from us, ignorance, barbarity out of which the world is emerging. And once more in promulgation, Abdul says, "Praise be to God, the medieval ages have passed away." And it also refers to the superannuated or antiquated beliefs and ignorances of the Dark Ages. So you see the Middle Ages being framed again as a period, a saeculum obscurum in Latin, a period of darkness. He then, the Guardian as well refers to the Middle Ages not infrequently. In a letter written to an individual believer in 1936, the Guardian speaks of how the Renaissance is essentially Islamic in its origin and redeemed Europe from, again, darkest barbarism. So we still see the image of darkness being used as a continual referent when relating to this period. Medieval has become a disparaging adjective in our modern era. We've heard the phrase, "I'll go medieval on you," or "the conditions here are medieval." We see the Guardian also uses medievalism in this disparaging sense. The learning of the madrasas of Shia Islam is described as medieval, deserted, and dilapidated. And finally, he used another reference of, among others I hope to find, he refers to the Qajar dynasty, especially the abuse of Aga Muhammad Khan, as constituting medieval oppression. It's interesting that we're using the word medieval to refer to the Islamic world, because it's debatable whether the Islamic world is one to which medieval can be applied as a category. Of course, what we now know as the Middle Ages was a flourishing time, a golden age in Islam. And yet medieval, from a European framework, is being used to characterize the degradation of the Shia sect. But medieval imagery persists throughout the Baha'i writings. We refer to the Knights of Baha'u'llah, who went on a 10-year crusade. We speak of nobility of character and aristocratic almost imagery. It's been noted the similarities between the pioneering goals and the spread of Christianity. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, Europe was Christianized largely by monks coming from the British Isles, particularly Ireland. And we see here the British Isles are the point of departure for the 10-year crusade. In Durham, England, where I studied, there's an oral tradition among the Baha'is attributed to Hand of the Cause Farabi, who said that Durham as a cathedral city had a particular distinction, as Durham was a place from which Christian missionaries departed in the Middle Ages, so Baha'i teachers will depart from Durham today. I don't have a textual source for that, but I've heard it repeated in that context. It's also my understanding, though I've not found a source for this, a written source, that Baha'is were encouraged to move to cathedral cities in Britain in the 1960s. But beyond the writings of the central figures, we also see the Middle Ages appearing in Baha'i popular folklore. When I had the opportunity to study in Iceland, I became aware of an oral tradition among Baha'is of Iceland who see in an Old Norse text, Old Norse being the language of the so-called Vikings, that spoken largely from about 700 CE to about 1400 CE. One of the most outstanding of poems, monuments of Old Norse poetry, is the Völuspá, or the Seeress's Prophecy, a identifiably pre-Christian poem in the voice of a woman anticipating the apocalypse and a golden age which will arise after it. We can identify this poem as pre-Christian based on its rhyme scheme. Icelandic and Old Norse, the language which precedes it, have very specific and rigorous schemes of rhyme and vowel length. So we can tell from the vowel length of this poem that it was written before Christianization. Some Icelandic Baha'is, however, have interpreted the Völuspá as anticipating the Baha'i world order. And there are some uncanny similarities. It speaks of an emergence of a moral civilization after a time of moral breakdown. For example, in Völuspá, it speaks of a future age in which brothers will fight and kill each other, sisters' children will defile kinship. It is harsh in the world, whoredom rife, an axe age, a sword age, shields are riven, a wind age, a wolf age, before the world goes headlong. And couldn't we compare that to the breakdown and the disintegration of the old world order? But near the conclusion of Völuspá, it talks about Balder returning, Balder, a shining god in Norse mythology who's been compared to the figure of Christ, and also the sons of brothers, specifically the sons of two brothers ruling over the world. And you could interpret those two brothers as referring to, of course, the Bab and Baha'u'llah. So this interpretation of Völuspá is not authoritative, but it's an interesting example of how a Baha'i community has used the medieval text to frame their understanding of the emergence of the Baha'i world order. Also thinking of the previous talk about seed, root, and branch, in Old Norse, there's Yggdrasil, the world tree. And we can see some resonances between the tree of life, Baha'u'llah's family as the tree, and Yggdrasil. So how did this notion appear that the Middle Ages are dark? And is this an accurate ascription? The term Dark Ages has been attributed to Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca, who popularized the threefold model of the world into ancient, medieval, and modern. But Petrarch was writing with a bias. He was a Renaissance humanist who saw his own age as one of reemergence from a saeculum obscurum, a dark age. And he was celebrating the achievements of what he considered to be the Renaissance or Renaissance humanism. So we see that this term is ideologically freighted. It is a rhetorical term, in the words of Matthew Hewley, a socially constructed term, as much as an accurate description of a period of history. And this term, the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, has been its root has been found in Petrarch's poem Africa, a chronicle of the Punic War, where he speaks of his fate being to live in a dark time of confusing storms, but with hope for a better age when the darkness will be dispersed and our descendants, the ancient Romans and Greeks, can come again in their former pure radiance. So we see this example of the Middle Ages being used as a rhetorical point of comparison, often a negative one, with emerging modernity. Now, this is troubling to me as a medieval historian and a challenge, because there's been a wealth of scholarship recently redeeming the so-called Dark Ages, the earlier part of the Middle Ages in Western Europe, as a time of rich, vibrant, and dynamic cultural creativity. Examples abound. We have the famous Sutton Hoo helmet, a masterpiece of early English, also called Anglo-Saxon art. The Book of Kells, a marvelous illustrated New Living Manuscript of the Bible. The Frank's casket with scenes carved in ivory, and the famous Celtic crosses as well. So it is somewhat disconcerting for me to see this era, which I see so much creativity in, being described by infallible divine authorities as one of darkness. How am I to reconcile this as a historian? But before we can talk about whether this is an accurate portrayal of the Middle Ages, we have to define our categories, define what the Middle Ages are. And this term is increasingly fraught and disputed to the point where some scholars are beginning to abandon medieval as a category as they abandoned the phrase Dark Age in previous decades. The traditional definition of the Middle Ages is the period in Western Europe from the fall of the last Western Roman Emperor Augustulus in 476 CE to the fall of Constantinople in 1453, or, depending on your definition, Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church door. So the word medieval comes from the phrase medium aevum, which means age in between. It's the in-between period between Rome and modernity. However, how widespread is this? Can we apply this term? How useful is it as we expand outward from the narrow sphere of Western Europe? Are the Byzantines medieval? They certainly flirt. For the Byzantine Empire, Rome never collapsed, at least until 1453 AD. So can we call their culture medieval since it was not in between Rome and another period? They were the living Roman Empire in the East. Is Islamic civilization medieval? We talk about medieval Islamic philosophy, but Islam was affected, but less so, by the Rome to modernity gap. What about African civilizations such as Axum, Mali, or Great Zimbabwe, who manifested many medieval style features analogous to Western Europe, kingship, aristocratic rule, and so on, but did not experience as much of a post-Roman collapse? And what about civilizations further afield from Western Europe? The Chinese, the Mississippians, also known as the Mound Builders. Can they accurately be called medieval? They may have been coeval, not evil in the sense of evil, but coveval, coeval with the medieval period, but was their culture definably medieval? So to what degree can we expand this term beyond Western Europe? Some scholars propose that we can talk about a global Middle Ages, that there are common resonant features of cultures between about 500 and 1500 CE across the planet. Others have said a more effective category would be the global pre-modern. Yet this itself is a contested category because modernity is equated with the Enlightenment, and we've just been discussing some of the fallibilities of the Enlightenment. Could we consider the Mississippian city of Cahokia now in Illinois, now larger than London at its time, to be a medieval city? These questions cannot be resolved in this talk, but they can. I do want to highlight how these categories are slippery and escape easy definition. So what I'd like to propose is that what we see in the writings of Abdul Baha, Shoghi Effendi, and later Baha'i historians is an example of medievalism. Medievalism is, according to Louis Darsin, the reception, interpretation, and recreation of the European Middle Ages in post-medieval cultures. The way the Middle Ages are used politically, rhetorically, and so on. And the use of medievalism often tells us more about the age that's acting medieval than the medieval period themselves. The medievalism also offers contrapuntal in the phrases of the Cambridge Companion to Medievalism, readings of the present. The Middle Ages are the other against which modernity or post-modernity defines itself. I'd like to share some examples of medievalism. In entertainment, from Monty Python to Game of Thrones to Dungeons and Dragons to the Renaissance festivals, the Middle Ages are everywhere. There's a great thirst in the modern era to relive the Middle Ages, but often a constructed Middle Ages which bears very little resemblance to the actual behavior of the period. Gaming is a huge multi-billion-dollar industry, and it causes the question why so many people in this age want to either retreat or embrace an earlier age. But medievalism is not confined solely to the world of games and entertainment. It's also the field of reenaction. I have been drawn to this period from a very young age. There's me dressed as a Carthusian monk, giving an exhibit of manuscripts at Durham Cathedral. And I myself have been caught up in medievalism and found that much of my own engagement with this period is medievalist rather than authentically medieval. And can we even use the word authenticity in defining this period? Itself a contested category. But medievalism also extends to the worlds of art. Dante Gabriel Rossetti would use medieval imagery in the Romantic periods. The Romantics embraced this sense of the medieval as an idealized pre-industrial age of a green and pleasant land in England. Or this cathedral, you'd think this would be from 15th century or earlier in Europe, but no, this cathedral is in Savannah, Georgia. It's an example of Victorian Gothic, the way the Victorians and early 20th century appropriated and used medieval imagery. But there are also more troubling uses of medievalism emerging. Neo-Nazis, white nationalists, the radical right have adopted medieval imagery and used it to promote messages of hate. Here we see the Old Norse Odal rune being used by a neo-Nazi group. The Middle Ages are a battleground today, a battleground for which we use as a proxy place in which to act out modern day battles around issues of race and class in particular. But there's also anti-racist medievalisms. The Medievalists of Color Network was recently formed representing medievalists who are non-white, who have experienced great persecution in engaging with this period. Another example would be the artist Kehinde Wiley, who uses Renaissance tropes to depict modern young black men, inserting young black men into the great narrative of art from which they have been excluded. Medievalism also extends into Baha'i historiography as well, the writing of history. Udo Schäfer, in his amazing book, Baha'i Ethics in the Light of Scripture, makes frequent comparisons to Thomas Aquinas, who was just mentioned, Aquinas' Summa Theologica, as well as the Buddhist Dhammapada. This is a book that I think has been overlooked and is a tremendous resource, which I think will be very influential on Baha'i scholarship in years to come. But in comparing the Baha'i laws to Aquinas, it gives rigor and gravitas to the Baha'i theology in the eyes of our interfaith people with whom we're engaged in dialogue. It's easy for the Baha'i faith to be seen as New Age or airy-fairy or so on. But when we can talk to a Christian theologian and make references to Aquinas, this gives credibility to our faith in their eyes. Another great medievalist who's made a contributor to Baha'i writings is Marzieh Gale, the translator of The Seven Valleys, The Four Valleys, The Secret of Divine Civilization. Marzieh Gale was a remarkable scholar and translator, but her training was as a European medievalist. So the person who gave us The Seven Valleys in English was a scholar of the Avignon papacy, the period in which there were three competing claimants to be pope. A time of remarkable creativity in the Middle Ages. Her book, Avignon in Flower, is a beautifully poetic study of the Avignon papacy. She also wrote two other books, which I've not yet read, Life in the Renaissance and The Three Popes. And after the 10-year crusade was concluded, she returned home and entered a period of writing. But the 60s were a remarkably productive time for the faith, a time of great growth and dynamism. And this raised the question, why would one of our most outstanding translators in a time of great growth dedicate her time to medieval scholarship? And it's a question I've not yet resolved, but I am very curious to research further the intersections between Marzieh Gale's work as a medievalist and her work as a Baha'i translator. And to conclude, I'd like to show one more example of medievalism in the Baha'i writings, which is not in the content, but in the style of the writings of the Guardian. The Guardian attended Oxford University and previously studied at schools in Syria, I believe, to perfect his English. He said, my goal is to perfect my English, to acquire the literary ability to write it well, speak it well, and translate correctly and eloquently from Persian, Arabic, into English. So this raised the question to me, if he undertook a course of English studies at Oxford, did he encounter Old and Middle English, the language of Beowulf and the Canterbury Tales? I've not yet come across a source for Shoghi Effendi's coursework or readings. If anyone's aware of where I could find such a source, I'd be very grateful. But I find it unlikely that he would complete a course of English studies without encountering Beowulf or the Canterbury Tales or any of the great monuments of Old and Middle English literature. And I would like to suggest that we can see echoes of a pattern we see in medieval literature in the Guardian's writing and translation, particularly that of alliteration. For example, take this passage from God Passes By, which is a feast of alliteration. We speak about traversing the somber sky of Persia. We see his satellites, a galaxy of God-intoxicated heroes, mounted above the same horizon, irradiate with the same incandescent light, with the self-same swiftness. Alliteration after alliteration, making this text very powerful and beautiful to read aloud. Now, alliteration, rhyme is more a characteristic of modern poetry, but alliteration is a characteristic of Old English, also known as Anglo-Saxon poetry, particularly Beowulf. I like to show you the first lines of Beowulf, and my pronunciation is a little rusty, but Listen for the alliteration. What? We garda and ger dagam, thed kunninga thrimga frunon, who the atherlinga settling fremadon, off shelled chafing shathan a threatham, monigam matham, male settler off there, exode orlas. And we can see a translation here from Francis Gumer, which also attempts to recapture that element of alliteration, which gives a sense of drive and forward motion to poetry. So is there a possibility that in his English training, the Guardian encountered Beowulf and borrowed these poetic elements? I don't yet know, but this is going to be an avenue for further research. So I hope to have shown you that the Baha'i faith engages with medievalism directly, the use of the Middle Ages as a rhetorical category, the use of the Middle Ages as a counterpoint to modernity and as a source of inspiration, both for Baha'i literature and Baha'i popular self-understanding. Thank you very much.